Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Kaplan. In today's episode, we're in conversation with Dr. Bright Gyamfi about a fascinating and necessary rethinking of decolonization, memory, and historical narrative. But rather than retelling familiar stories centered on nation states or political elites, this conversation turns towards what has often been overlooked and structurally erased. At the heart of this conversation is a shift in how we understand history itself. What happens when we take seriously the lives and intellectual labor of women who have often been excluded from official archives? What new forms of knowledge emerge when we move past traditional sources towards oral histories, personal archives, funeral pamphlets, photographs, and everyday practices? The conversation explores how African women, particularly figures like Anna Budu-Arthur, function not just as participants in decolonial movements, but as active producers of knowledge, shaping political consciousness through spaces often dismissed as apolitical: the home, the kitchen, fashion, and social life. These sites become arenas of resistance where culture, care, and aesthetics operate as tools of decolonization. The conversation also pushes us to think critically about erasure and historical memory, how national narratives and state commemorations systematically sideline women, even as communities continue to remember and honor them in other ways. In doing so, it challenges the persistence of great man histories within decolonial thought itself. At the same time, Gyamfi traces a broader intellectual geographic arc from Ghana to London, from port cities to global Black networks, from Pan-African congresses to intimate dinner table conversations. What emerges is a vision of decolonization not as a singular political event, but as a lived, everyday practice shaped by race, space, labor, and transnational connection. If you like what we do here, consider supporting the show on patreon.com/everythingisideology or offer a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm extremely excited to have on Dr. Bright Gyamfi. He is an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. He holds a PhD in history from Northwestern University, an MSc in African Studies from the University of Oxford, and a BA in political science and history from the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining Rutgers, he served on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego, and was awarded the Presidential Fellowship, Northwestern University's highest honor for graduate students. His research examines the transnational networks of Ghanaian and African intellectuals whose work shaped African studies, Black internationalism, and economic development thought following African independence. His scholarship examines the global circulation of Nkrumahist and Pan-Africanist thought across the U.S., the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. Gyamfi's work has been supported by numerous fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, not an easy feat, the SSRC, Mellon International Dissertation Research Fellowship, and the Fulbright Fellowship. He has conducted extensive research across Ghana, Senegal, Grenada, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, France, the UK, and the US, some of which we'll be discussing and going over today. In addition to his scholarship, Gyamfi serves on the board of directors of the West African Research Association, the Ghana Studies Association, acting as president, and the Ghana Oxford and Cambridge Society. He is actively engaged in public-facing work, which fits very nicely with what we're up to right now, including policy consulting, media interviews, public lectures, exhibitions, and documentary filmmaking. So with that incredibly busy schedule, thank you so much for cutting out some time to talk to us and our audience. So I really enjoyed your piece. It follows a sort of critical turn within decolonial and post-colonial thought, going into sort of feministicy sort of directions. And it doesn't just center women's voices to sort of center women's voices. It centers women's voices to decolonize the field even more so and show other forms of knowledge acquisition against Eurocentric frameworks of epistemological kind of ways of knowing. So for instance, like in your article, I found it really, really cool how sort of you center where you got your research from. And one of the things happened to be a funeral pamphlet. And I
Yeah.
love that that was included, right? So
Uh-huh.
you never know where you're going to really, the trail is going to take you. And it seems like you had one idea for what this article could be. And then during your interview, you realized, oh man, this interview is the subject. This person I'm talking to is the subject. It seemed like what was happening. So I guess starting this, right? Can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you went about interviewing the person she was, introduce who the subject of your research in this particular article is?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you. I've enjoyed uh, the previous sessions that I watched on your channel. So, I mean, to start off, I've been interested in this man by the name Nana Katia, who I found his file, just one file of him at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. And I was very shocked. Like, who is this person? I've never really heard his name before. Nobody in Ghana seems to know him. But somehow, in that particular file, he had been invited by UNESCO to travel extensively across Latin America and the Caribbean in the hopes of organizing a major conference in Benin for UNESCO to kind of assess the ongoing similarities and differences between Africa and peoples of African descent in the Caribbean. In the course of my research, I discovered that he was very close to the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. However, a lot of his archival, basically everything had been destroyed when Nkrumah was overthrown, because Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. And as purging Nkrumah's influence, they destroyed books, burnt books on leftist thinking, on on Marxist ideas. They also arrested and deported a lot of scholars during that period. Right. So trying to figure out who this man was and his connection to Nkrumah and broader questions around decolonization, I found out that his sister was alive, and the sister was living in Sekondi Takrady in Ghana, southern part of Ghana. So during my time as a Fulbright scholar in Ghana, I decided to go visit her with the hopes of interviewing her about her brother. So when I got there, we started talking, and one of the strategies that I also use is that I don't start off with sets of questions. I try to get to know the person because I'm always interested in the stories that people choose to tell me and why they're telling me those things and what that speaks to larger processes. So I was thought we just having general conversations about Oxford because I was a student at Oxford. That's when she mentioned that her brother was at Oxford, but she also went to Oxford. And I became more interested about her life story. So we talked about Oxford. She then went to her room, brought all these pictures during her time at Oxford. And there was a particular picture that I even show in the article during the year that Ghana became independent, March 6, 1957. Right. She and a group of Ghanaians who were at Oxford at that time took this beautiful picture to archive the moment. Then she showed me letters from Maya Angelou, uh, pictures, and I was like, whoa, I have never heard of this woman before. She has a very rich history. Now that does not only just move beyond the nation state, but also the fact that she's archiving these moments herself begs the question of how do we take African women as serious archivists of a particular historical period, that they themselves as active knowledge producers, at, attentively aware of what is happening. So that is how come this article was basically birthed, to add to the literature of not just focusing on, this idea that women have been marginalized and we have to bring them into the spot. but asking new sets of questions of women as activist. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And sort of also like they index a totally different material sort of archive as well in terms of you talk about clothing, in terms of making cuisine, in terms of like making more of the cultural spaces within the home, decolonizing the home in different ways according to Akan matrilineal practices is something that women offer and has been largely neglected, as you write, from larger sort of decolonial narratives that oddly in various ways fall into aspects of great man theory. Like a lot of people, like the average sort of person, might know about the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, but like won't know anything about the historical process, what happened afterwards, what led to it, the various sort of other figures in it. Like it's all folded into a great man to some
Yes.
degree, right?
Yes.
And this helps uncover it. One thing that you do in this, you seem to be following something, Jean Allman's argument, which is she's looking at how do processes of erasure and sanctioned forgetting operate. And you kind of draw on this idea to unfold your argument. Could you talk about the ways in which women have first been decentered or erased from traditional forms of decolonial narratives?
Hmm. So Jean's article for me was very foundational because Jean's article was about the 50th when Ghana was celebrating its 50th anniversary. There were statues built in honor of the people, quote unquote, who led us to independence. However, not a single woman was mentioned or honored. And Jane focused on a very famous Ghanaian nationalist. That this woman was so famous, the fact that she was so famous and yet erased, begs this question of how do we get to this erasure, right? What are the processes that sanctions that makes these things possible? So for me, looking at Budu-Arthur's own story, it served as a kind of template to build on Jean's invitation, right? But what was also interesting for me when when I read Jean's article, and also when I studied Budu-Arthur's life, that in Ghana the state is doing one thing, that being not focusing and recognizing the importance of women. But when you look at what ordinary Ghanaians are also doing outside of the state's formal organized events, they're actually honoring women like Honor Budu-Arthur, who also did play a role in spreading Nkrumah's message of self-determination, because Budu-Arthur also came from a space that had a lot of activist market women who funded Kwame Nkrumah's political party. She grew up under the tutelage of people like Grace Ayensu, who would later become one of the first women elected to the Ghanaian parliament in the early 60s, during Nkrumah's tenure. She grew up under the tutelage of another woman who earned the name Ama Nkrumah, which is the equivalent of Kwame Nkrumah, which is the female version, for her activist work. Honor Budu-Arthur, as a young lady, at that time she was in her 20s, also then went around organizing these women, younger women and younger folks, and established a younger kind of wing, political party, organization in Sekondi Takrady to get the message across, right? So for me, it was all about what happens when we also look at people who were not necessarily that famous compared to the Hannah Kujos whose work is important for Jean to recover and for me to build on Jean's invitation of taking women's activism and history seriously. So that is how come that work came about. and I began to ask these types of questions, right? I began to think about, well, people might not be interested in Anna Budu-Arthur because she did not attend Oxford University. But what happens if we begin to ask different sets of questions? That she's doing labor that is very, very important, like cooking, right? That by cooking, she is taking up a certain burden that some of these Ghanaian nationalist men are not doing, but will go on to take prominent political positions in Ghana, including her own brother, right? So this article is also a critique of my own other works as I am learning and engaging more. And also, it also allowed me to start thinking about her own ideas around actualizing Nkrumah's Pan-African vision by sewing clothes, African clothes, right? For both Africans and non-Africans during the early days of independence. Yeah.
That's great. And the last part of your answer also like kind of harks back to Edward Blyden's kind of African personality aspects too, which
Yeah.
we could certainly talk about as forms of kind of resistance and conscious raising through aesthetic practices and all these various things, which I'm sure we'll kind of talk about. Now, in your answer, geography plays a large role within the spatial framework and spatial racialization within Anna Buddha's kind of like life in different ways, like no matter sort of where she goes, because she was very internationalist, like an early sense of like Afro cosmopolitanism or whatever it might be. Um, she encounters basically the same sorts of structural materials everywhere she seems to go. And so, whether, that's her experience in being in South Carolina and everybody leaving the restaurant, because they
Mhm.
refuse to eat there and all of these things. And she experienced that with Maya Angelou. So, we'll definitely get into their
Mhm.
relationship and whatnot. But
Mhm.
I was wondering how you could talk about how a lot of how her own life and experiences and geographical location shaped her understanding of decolonialism and what race and all of these things look like.
No, that's a great question because for a lot of the time, most times, people have these binaries of settler colonies and non-settler colonies, right? And you have settler colonies like South Africa or Kenya, and non-settler colonies like Ghana, Nigeria, etc. And for these frameworks, these binary frameworks, it does not allow us to understand how race also functioned and operated in non-settler colonies like the Gold Coast. Because Anna Budu-Arthur grew up in the Gold Coast, particularly in Sekondi Takrady, that was divided along the lines of apartheid, where you had European town, European residents, African townships, European hospitals, African hospitals, right? That was shaping her own understanding around race. Sekondi Takrady too was the home of the first major railway and industrial port city in the Gold Coast, which meant that you also had an influx of various Africans coming to the Gold Coast in search for jobs. At the same time, too, you had the colonial government bringing workers from the West Indies to come to the Gold Coast to work on the railways. And those who came imbued this racial hierarchy as the West Indians above Africans. Hey, so this racialization of the city is segregation markers. The ways in which African laborers, railway workers were significantly underpaid. The extraction of gold from the hinterlands to the port. People like Anna Budu-Arthur witnessed all these things. Her brother worked in customs. So she would tell her what is happening, how they're seeing their natural resources being shipped to the Western countries. The market woman who, her mother, who was an important market woman, challenging colonial taxes. So Anna Budu-Arthur grew up understanding decolonization not as an abstract philosophy that we have to break away from colonial rule, that decolonization meant for her the ability to freely move around her city without being policed by these segregation markers. The ability for her and her people to enjoy the natural resources that they were extracting, right? So that is what decolonization meant for Anna Budu-Arthur, and that was what shaped her political outlook. So when Nkrumah later returns from the UK after spending 2 years in the UK and then 10 years in the United States, and he talking about decolonization, it found common synergies with what Budu-Arthur and others were experiencing on the ground.
That's great. Very astute answer. Thank you so much. Within that, it also seems within like these various forms of racialized labor, there also seems to be a question of kind of like class status as well.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's a reason why certain people were able to see certain things and contest certain things. Like the position of the labor woman made it so that they could involve themselves and throw themselves into a material struggle against colonial pricing and taxes. I think the position you occupy within the race and labor market actually plays a role in what you see and what you could do as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Um, so I wanted to ask also, you mentioned how Bodu sort of upsets kind of various binaries, right? And one way she does this is by not throwing away various ingenuities that are quote unquote like that are helpful technologies that come from the metropole, that come from the colonial system, but to use those towards the ends for African flourishing.
Uh-huh.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about her nuanced understanding of.
Mhm. No, for sure. Because for people like Budu-Arthur, decolonization did not mean a complete rejection of everything Western, but rather it was a rejection of the exploitation forces that imperialism perpetuated. So for her, things that came from the West, in terms of even the way that people, there were these kind of machines that they were using for garbage collections that kept the city clean and all these things. It's just like we have to maintain these things. So in my conversation with her, she always stressed the idea of picking and choosing. We pick and choose the things that will benefit us and reject the things that are harmful. Right? And it's the same way that she critiques later the post-colonial government that came after colonial rule, both during the Nkrumah era as well as subsequent eras. So for her, it's all about these critical thinking, about people-centered approach that benefit the community. Yeah, that is what I was saying.
Yeah, no, that's great. And also the community then turns into a space of like the home, and then there's this mixture of the political and the home space, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm.
it's interesting because like while a lot of during like sort of during American communist kind of parties and movements and stuff, while they were sort of fighting various elements of Jim Crow, the white party members and whatnot would still not invite black party members to their home for dinner, right?
Right.
So her home acts as a space of sort of cross-cultural dialogue and decolonization. But in the paper, you also talk about this rub that sort of happens where it's like cross-cultural dialogue cannot take into account structural differences.
Yes.
So
Yes.
therefore, like while you might be having a good time and eating
Mhm,
food together and
mhm.
whatnot, you're still going to be eating food in a neighborhood that's impoverished systematically, and yeah, that sort of stuff. Um, so she Bodu played a role in kind of as an academic and as an intellectual sort of in her own right, it seems. And in your narrative, you discuss the ways in which she educated people during these dinner conversations and
Yeah.
whatnot. So I was
Mhm.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role she played in sort of knowledge production.
Mm. Yes. So one thing that is very important for us to contextualize the important work that she was even doing at Oxford is is the fact that in the 50s and 60s, African history was completely rejected. There was a very famous professor at Oxford who even made a remark in 1963, which was later published in a book in 1965, that why are students demanding for them to be taught African history? That African history does not exist. That the only history that matters is the history of Europeans in Africa, right? And that was Trevor Roper of Oxford University, which kind of aligned with the same theme that Hegel and others in the 18th, 19th century had perpetuated of Africa as this dark continent. So, Budu-Arthur, in her own way, was trying to challenge the demonization of Africa as backwards by introducing people to African cuisine. The African cuisine is something that is rich in health, right? The African cultural practices, the way that women are valued, the matrilineal system that she's coming from, the importance of women. She's having conversations with people challenging this whole idea of women supposed to be at the back burner, right? She's also pushing a kind of Pan-African engagement with other Africans, telling them that, hey, we have to come together. We have to imbue this idea of Pan-African unity that Nkrumah is inviting us to really carry forward. When Nkrumah stated on March 6, 1957, that Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. Right? So she's also engaging West Indians, pushing them to challenge this idea that they are much superior than Africans, inviting them to reject this whole notion that West Indians are not Africans. Because in the archives, you will see a number of, some letters from West Indians themselves saying that they look to Europe, not to Africa. That Africa has nothing to offer because of this buying into this racialization of Africa as the constructive other, right? That Africa is the antithesis of Europe, something that Edward Blyden from the West Indies, he himself upheld some of these racist racist views about Africa. But later, the more he engaged with Africa, right, the more he began to reject these things. So Budu-Arthur allows us to really understand on the ground, at the heart of empire, how she is trying, in her own ways, trying to break down the grips that empire have had on people's minds and the way that people see and viewed Africa, and which I think was very, very important for her to do in the 50s and 60s and throughout even the 70s.
Yeah, it's still very much a worthy cause today.
Mhm.
Um, so it seems like, a lot of these narratives that you mentioned, like the traditionalist narratives, presuppose that decolonization can only take place in certain ways. It
Mhm.
can't take place in, say, like the kitchen. Like they demarcate the space in which decolonization occurs. And what I thought was really cool about this piece, one of the really cool things, was that you're doing that work of expanding where this stuff even takes place, right? And I thought that was really helpful. And one of the places that becomes a site of struggle is sort of clothing,
Mhm.
and fashion and
Mhm.
all these sort of various enterprises. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how Boodoo used fashion, and then also we could start getting into, if you want, her relationship with Maya Angelou as well.
Okay. So, for sure. So with fashion, right? Because when Nkrumah came, fashion was a huge thing. Fashion was both a signal to unify the nation state of Ghana and also to project a new image of Africa. So one of the things that Nkrumah did on the day of independence, when he stood on stage to give his famous speech in 1957, was to wear fugu, which comes from the northern part of Ghana. And what is interesting is that Nkrumah comes from the southern part of Ghana. And there has been a kind of divide between the southern part of Ghana and the northern part of Ghana. The north is seen as this underdeveloped compared to the south as being much more developed, because you had Europeans staying staying closer to the south than they did to the north. So clothing became a way of constructing a Ghanaian identity that took into consideration other marginalized societies. Even recently, the current president of Ghana, when he went to Zambia, wore that famous fugu, right? And we've seen him several times on the UN stage, has been also wearing it. So you see clothing as a kind of unifying rallying point for Ghanaians. But at the same time too, they use kente cloth as to symbolize Pan-African engagement. Right? Today we see a lot of most universities who participate and who organize graduation, especially Black graduations, having the kente stool. Even in 2020, we saw in Congress, right, Nancy Pelosi and others kneeling down and wearing the famous kente stool. And that kente stool was really popularized by Du Bois in a way when he was being honored and given an honorary degree from University of Ghana. And the person who ironically hooted him was Anna Budu-Arthur's brother, right? So Anna Budu-Arthur, also being a seamstress, you saw her role as using clothing to push Pan-Africanism, to push African unity in London. And what makes London also unique is the fact that you have all these people coming from the British Empire from Barbados, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, all being in London, right? So, in a way, she was extending Ghana's influence into these spaces. And it was in London where she met Maya Angelou. Because Maya Angelou had stayed in Ghana during Nkrumah's tenure and had worked in Ghana, had worked with Budu-Arthur's brother as well. So Budu-Arthur's brother, Nana Kwabena Nketia, when Maya was moving to London for a brief time, invited, told Maya Angelou that, hey, she can go and stay with her sister in London. Anna Budu-Arthur at that time was working in the Ghanaian High Commission in the UK, the education section. And they became very good friends. So as a matter of fact, Maya's first memoir, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, she wrote it while she started writing it while she was living in the apartment of Anna Budu-Arthur. And that's how they both developed really close friendships that we can, talk more about throughout. But it is important to know the ways in which Anna Budu-Arthur herself was building on a tradition of Ghanaian women, because there was another famous woman by the name Chez Julie, who was basically the first kind of fashion designer in Ghana. She was trained in Paris, and she began to sew African clothes in a way that made Africans, Ghanaians proud and carried the message of Pan-Africanism. She's much, much more famous than Budu-Arthur. And yet Budu-Arthur is building upon the work of these famous Ghanaian women, right? In her own way, in her own small corner of the world, trying to push Ghana to the world.
Thank you so much. And I'm really happy you started talking about Pan-Africanism because I'm kind of curious. Like, with Pan-Africanism, it seems like there's sort of like a historical trajectory in its course and thought and leaders and what it meant at different times, and also obviously in different places. Like, Pan-Africanism meant totally different things in different eras and whatnot. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the historical content and/or trajectory of Pan-Africanism and also its relationship to women.
Okay.
I know it's a big question, I
Oh,
apologize.
this is a great question, though. So, when it comes to Pan Africanism, as the narrative goes, there have been several Pan African congresses. Right? The first one being in 1900 in London, which was kind of spearheaded by one lawyer from Trinidad and Tobago. I think Sylvester Williams, I think that's the name. And so you have that Pan African Congress, and they've always been women at these Pan African Congresses, right? But but largely, when we talk about the Pan African Congresses, women are kind of marginalized, right? Although people like Amy Garvey and Arne uh, Julia Cooper and others were in attendance. There's a nice book by Hakeem Adi, who's written Pan Africanism: A History, that I highly recommend, that traces the various trajectories of Pan Africanism. But when it comes to Pan Africanism, these Pan African Congresses, it had also been mostly a kind of elite endeavor. Right? You have these lawyers, doctors who are involved. And their main critique, in a way, was not a breakaway from colonial rule, but rather a kind of, we have to ensure that colonialism or imperialism is treating us as humans. Right? So it's like it's a more of a reformist engagement. But when we get to the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which also takes place in Manchester, in the United Kingdom, what is significant about that Fifth Pan-African Congress is that you move away from it being a very much elitist lawyers and doctors to including trade unionists, students, a kind of non-elite engagement, and having a more radical bent. Because now you have people like Kwame Nkrumah who are becoming involved. You have folks like the communist, intellectual, Pan-Africanist George Padmore from Trinidad and Tobago, right? Du Bois is still present at that time. And you also have a much more presence of Africans involved in that particular conference. And what also makes it unique is their forceful engagement that the battle for African independence has to be fought on the African continent. And there's a larger demand to also break away from the yoke of colonialism. And some of these folks too were not imagine African independence as a kind of nation state approach. It was more of, a regional and continental approach. That even in 1945, Nkrumah and Co. established the West African Secretariat, where they are making the argument that West Africa is one country, that West Africa must be free. So while the Fifth Pan-African Congress was taking place in Manchester, those on the continent of Africa were very much attentive and attuned to this process. And women like Anna Budu-Arthur raised money in the Gold Coast to support the proceedings of the Fifth Pan-African Congresses. But their names don't necessarily make it to the archives, to the certain archives that is also being curated. Right? But women are very much present in these spaces, fundraising, supporting the Pan-African, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which of course, later when Nkrumah comes to Ghana, kind of finds a home in the Gold Coast. So Ghana's independence for so many people became the physical manifestation of the Pan-African goals and aspiration, right? For so many people coming from Africa, coming from the Caribbean, coming from the US, Ghana had become a kind of, in the words of the American historian Kevin Gaines, a kind of destination of radical hope for people seeking freedom. And Nkrumah himself went out of his way to finance a number of African liberation movements. People like Robert Mugabe, who we can have our own critique of, came to Ghana and studied in Ghana at that particular time. And he became a school teacher in Sekondi Takrady, where he met and married Sally Mugabe, who was also good friends with Anna Budu-Arthur, although Anna Budu-Arthur was much older, was, slightly older than Sally Mugabe, right? So you have, and Sally Mugabe will go on to play an important role in galvanizing African women in London for them to also pay attention to what is the struggles for Southern African liberation, including the time when Mugabe himself was arrested And Sally herself, I believe, was put in prison when she was for political activism. Her political activism in uh, Rhodesia, which will later become Zimbabwe. So these women, like Sally Mugabe, Anna Budu-Arthur, Amy Garvey, and the rest, played very, very important role in not just articulating the Pan-African vision, but also in 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 supporting it financially as well.
Thank you. That's really clarificatory and helpful, right? And it's interesting, a lot of these various conversations with sort of different African intellectuals and revolutionaries and sort of different folks that were sympathetic, coming from different places, et cetera, took place in London, which is, the metropole, which is, there's so many various contradictions. It's
Yes.
pretty wild. There's a lot of stuff going
Mhm,
on here in terms of
mhm.
just overlapping and contradictions and
Yeah.
teasing it out.
Mm.
Obviously takes dissertations and books, which is,
Yes,
what
yes.
we talk
Yeah,
about here and all this.
yeah, there's an amazing two amazing books that I would highly recommend for your listeners, by Mark Marita. His wonderful book on Black London. He's a great mentor of mine. I would highly recommend, like, Black London to people trying to understand this London as a kind of space for radical thinking. Ironically, right? The heart of metropole that is bringing all these folks from the Caribbean, from Africa together. Right? And also another book that I would highly recommend by Dr. Kennedy Perry, a dear mentor to me as well. Her book is called London is a Place for Me. So there's something to be said about the radicalization of people going to London. And what makes London an interesting space is people connecting the dots. That a fight against colonialism cannot be a kind of nation state focus. It has to be an international endeavor for us to fully diagnose the structures of imperialism and colonial.
Yeah, thank you. Beautifully said. Um, so would you mind kind of whenever I think about like the contradictions and stuff of people doing one thing and against another, I think of like the Haitian Revolution, generally speaking, where it's like, using the sort of French revolutionary signifiers and markers and stuff against the French to fight for something new, but at the same time blurring the lines between who is French and what is French, thus showing the hypocrisy of Western liberalism,
Mhm.
this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of the various sort of elements on the ground that were related to Budu, sort of like she's in the Conventional People's Party and the Estacado Youth Organization, and
Mhm.
also even like the founding of Estacado and kind of like the gentrification and forced displacement that happened, stuff like that, specifically in this context.
Yeah, so one of the things to understand about Budu-Arthur and her family is that her family was forcibly removed from their land to create what would become known as European town, where they built these European residents, European hospitals, and parks for Europeans to have a kind of good life that at the same time is separated from quote unquote the natives, right? And that that really affects Buddha Arthur's family because by removing her family, they also destroy palaces, stools to make way for this creation. So in a way, there was an active, eh, in a kind of, and how do I put it, an epistemic violence in a way, with the erasure of their history. uh, That is on the ground. So people are attentive to these things. That is shaping Buddha author's own engagement. Her family, her family resist some of these encroachments, right? Taxes, colonial taxes on market women. Her mother was one of the, I think, the fisher, the queens of the market women, especially those who are selling fishes in the market, because you have these various queens in the market, queens for plantain, for yams, so that there's always tomatoes, people who are controlling and organizing, right? So these are very powerful women who are also trading beyond the boundaries of the Gold Coast. So colonial taxes, they are protesting these things. Right? That is shaping Budu-Arthur's own engagement as she's growing up, seeing women being at the forefront against anti-colonial activism. So when Budu-Arthur is coming of age, also seeing the damage that is being done to her own family as they're pushing and protesting, it really influenced her to have these conversations with her mother, with her grandmother, with her aunties about freedom. What is freedom? What does it look like? And for them, they began to articulate freedom as having the ability to control their own prices, the ability to not have to pay insane colonial taxes, right? So in a way, economic independence as well as political independence. So in 1947, some of her mentors, including Grace Ayensu, who was also a very close family friend, along with her brother, helped form the first major political party in the Gold Coast, known as the Conventional People's Party. And within that space, that was when the UGCC invited Kwame Nkrumah, because of his activist work in London and the US, to become the general secretary. When Nkrumah joins the political party in 1948, however, the UGCC, for most scholars and most people, were mostly a conservative political party, very elitist, made up of lawyers and business, elite businessmen who also did not necessarily believe in immediate independence. They wanted a more of a gradual path to independence. So by 1949, Isayensu, Nkrumah's, Nketia Budu-Arthur's brother, and others break away to form the CPP. And when they formed the CPP, for them, they demanded immediate independence. Nothing about gradual independence, but rather immediate independence. And they met in Budu-Arthur's home, because she was staying with her brother and her mother, so she was privy to some of these conversations, which influenced her to also participate in the CPP and to help establish the Escado Youth Organization to start spreading and educating people about the ills of colonialism, as to why it is important for us to declare independence. So these things on the ground influenced her and pushed her to become an active member in that process. So by 1950, she, her family members, along with Nkrumah and others, had declared positive action, which was a series of political boycotts. The colonial government were really mad about this political action, arrested Nkrumah, arrested her brother. As a matter of fact, they beat her brother into a coma. His bones were broken. As she recalled in an interview to me, their grandmother died out of shock for what had transpired. So people like Honorable Budu-Arthur, they really paid deeply for Ghana for Ghana's independence. And it was a struggle that they were willing to die for because they believe in the cause of being an independent nation.
Mm, beautifully said. There was a few things in here that I kind of wanted to ask you about just to clarify. I was curious, like, and your answer just very impactful, so my voice is all somber right now.
Mhm,
Um, but you note that I think you note that, and I wrote you note, but it's really sort of Arthur Bud Anna Budu is kind of noting this. She thinks that it seems like race, blackness, and empire cannot be separated from Africa's spatial position. And
mhm,
it'd be
mhm.
really it would be really cool if you said a little bit more about that, expanded on that sort of notion and idea, what that means and is getting at.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes precisely as I mentioned before, the space in which she grew up in, right? The fact that you have African American soldiers who were stationed in Ghana during both World War I and World War II as well. Hey, especially during World War II, she engages some of these people. Her brother engages these people, right? And in conversations, because African American soldiers are not being paid the same rate as their white American counterparts. And the Gold Coast soldiers are also not being paid at the same rate as these white people. And the West Indians, who at first had seen themselves as quote unquote better than the Africans, have come to realize that no matter what, they cannot assimilate into this hierarchy where the white Europeans were going to treat them as equals. They're not being paid at the same rate as well. So all of a sudden, when these groups are coming together in the Gold Coast, having conversations, they begin to fully accept that imperialism, blackness, is a global phenomenon that has to be tackled in a unified space. Right? So it is what then sets the stage for people like Honorable Budu-Arthur before she even leaves for London to have a black internationalist perspective. So she did not necessarily develop that when she got to London and before, she engaged these Caribbeans or African Americans, but the Gold Coast itself gave an opportunity because of the lived experience, her lived experience, her conversations with folks from the Caribbean, West Indies, and African Americans that began to shape her own understanding about the interconnections between blackness, racism, and empire.
That's great. No, that definitely helps. Thank you so much for expounding upon that, right? All these things conflate into one massive sort of project of a global sort of economic and epistemological white supremacy. Like,
Mhm.
and this is, people living within that, it seems like.
Exactly.
And then seeing their overlapping solidarities and structural positions, regardless of the government,
Mhm,
so
mhm,
to speak.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, so forgive me if this question kind of overlaps, but I wanted to ask, so again, her position sort of within a geographical space, like and in and around a sort of port city, what role did sort of the port city or just seeing the ocean play in shaping an awareness of a sort of global Black cosmopolitan subject?
I mean, it played a huge role. I mean, the fact that you were living in a port city, there's even this the dissertation of James Scott when he talks about a common wind. how these ideas of freedom are constantly just moving around these ships. So you have sailors who are bringing news, right? And even in my current book manuscript, there's an interview of this one guy who was not radical at all. He went to go fight in World War II, came back to Sekendi Takrade, and he was so radicalized by what he had seen, his conversations with others around freedom. He's telling his people, why are we sitting here? We have to start demanding for our own freedom. And of course, at the same time, like I made mention, the folks who were stationed in Ghana, seeing these things play out, seeing how the atrocities that Europeans were committing against each other, that how can they have monopoly over this idea of great human civilization? Because they were making the argument, Europeans were making the argument that Africans were not civilized. And thus, they use colonization as a means of civilizing Africans and to justify the exploitation of Africans. But for Africans who are also seeing the brutality the Europeans are causing against each other, so how can you have a more moral monopoly over this issue? So people began to challenge that. People began to also think about, well, the idea of race and racism. I mean, if you look at the newspapers coming from Sekendi Takrade in the 40s and 50s, everything is about race and racism. People were debating race and racism, which challenges this whole idea of, quote unquote, West Africans not having a notion of race. As scholars sometimes argue, and sometimes which is also perpetuated by African scholars, even Chimamanda, the Nigerian writer, saying that she did not know that she was black until she came to the US. Which, of course, is not to say that it's false. It's definitely, for a lot of Africans, that is their lived experience. But for a different generation, and the generation of the Budu-Arthurs, that is not their lived experience. Their lived experience was very much around race and racism. Around the fact that in certain parts of Ghana, people needed to carry passports in order to move around. Right? So all these things are shaping people. And the fact that they live in a port city is also allowing for news to come from the Americas into the Gold Coast, and for news from the Gold Coast to also be pushed to the Americas. Right? So it gives this kind of, it births a black internationalist, black radical tradition from Africa that sometimes folks that focus simply on African American history are not attentive to in that process. No.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's always a good move and maybe the correct move to sort of center African consciousness on the continent as the thing that spurs various movements across the world. You know, this is the thing that was emanating out. This is what Malcolm X kind of reminded us to do when we're doing history and whatnot, these sorts of things. And this idea of sort of becoming and noticing oneself in the face of others reminds me very much of like Harlem Renaissance poetry, Zora Neale Hurston, How It Feels to Be Colored Me sort of thing, when she realizes herself through others when she leaves her Florida town, you know, that sort of thing. Um, but that's great. This was a lot of fun. I don't want to take up too much of your time, even though I know I could.
Okay.
Um, but I have, I guess, maybe one last question, and it's relatively a fun question. So did Anna Buddha Arthur read this or see it or know it exists?
No, I mean, she definitely knew it existed, because we had so many conversations. She knew I was working on it, but unfortunately, she died before it was printed. And that is how come also I included the funeral brochure. But we talked extensively about it because I told her that although I came to write something about her brother, her story is too interesting for me not to tell the world. You know, that's when I dedicated the time to really work on this piece, also to honor her memory, her legacy, as we remind ourselves the important role that African women have played in archiving and ensuring that they're not erased from historical memory.
Well, it's a beautiful tribute. So thank you so much for writing this. I learned so much from it and from this conversation. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
No, I mean, thanks for the invitation. I really enjoy talking to you. These are really great questions. And yeah, I look forward to more segments and just trying to ensure that, we remember people like Budu-Arthur and we tell her story and highlight her contributions and what we can learn from her lived experience as well.
100%, 100%. The best theory comes from lived reality. So
Exactly.
thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be in contact.
Yeah. Thank you.